So I came to the realisation, the conclusion that the Flavians had been involved in the creation of the Christian religion just by understanding the realpolitik of that whole period, by cutting through the propaganda and stepping aside from the various Christian claims and the religious literature of the period, understanding the processes of power in that period, understanding the geopolitics, understanding the threats from the east Rome was facing, understanding the power vacuum that was there in Rome, understanding the ways in which the Flavian dynasty had to legitimise itself, and understanding the extent of their Jewish problem, if you like. At this time, it's said that, by some figures at least, that the Jews constituted some 10%, 10-12% of the Roman Empire, not just in Judea, but throughout the Roman Empire. There were often riots, there were often all sorts of ethnic tensions in the Roman Empire. It was through the study of those problems, how did the Romans deal with those problems, and leaving aside the historical claims of Christianity and also of Judaism, leaving those aside and just looking at it purely in terms of the mechanisms of power, that one begins to realise that, all right, the Flavians must have been involved in this process of trying to diffuse the religious and nationalist tensions in the east, in Judea. It's out of that whole mix that one finds the beginnings of Christian literature, the beginnings of Christian references to Christianity, and so on. And you just put two and two together and you realise that the two processes are surely related. Surprisingly, as I was coming to those conclusions, there were other people coming to those conclusions. There was, in particular, Joe Atwill, other people like that, who, independent of each other, were just looking at it in the cold light of day and stepping aside from 2,000 years of assumptions that have been sort of built into us by the historical claims of Christianity. When you put all of that aside, you realise that the Christian religion emerges at exactly the same time as those processes of power. One of the really surprising things for me too was to realise the extent of Roman control of propaganda and of literature. It was comprehensive. They imposed monolithic control of literature. It's not like in the modern period after the printing press and so forth, where the authorities effectively lose control of literature. Everyone can have a copy of the book in their hands, and it's very difficult to control literature like that. But in the ancient world, the Romans, when they clamped down on literature, they really did clamp down on literature. And the more you look at it, the more you piece it together, the more you realise that it was the consequence of deliberate policy and careful construction. Some suspect that it was a very deliberate policy and that there were a team of people who were there to construct a mythology, to take the force behind Jewish messianism and to reshape it into a force that the Romans could deal with. We can see this in rabbinic Judaism too. The Romans are faced with all different types of Jews. Some of them they can work with and some of them they can't. Some of them are accommodationist, some of them are cooperative, and some of them are zealots, in our terms fanatics, that they just can't deal with. And so the Romans have a policy of trying to suppress the zealots, but also to take the ideology of the zealots and try to negate it through literature, through propaganda. The earlier Romans hadn't quite understood this, hadn't understood how bookish the Jews were. The Flavians do, and the Flavians mobilise the Roman civil service, the Roman propaganda machine, if you like, to create ideas and literature that can negate this virulent and dangerous ideology. Now, the Romans had destroyed the Sadducees, and in the Dead Sea Scrolls we see another group who've been shed and who've sort of disappeared from history. They deposited their books in caves, and presumably they expected to come back and collect them at some time, but they didn't. And so the books were still there because they didn't come back, presumably because they were wiped out. The Pharisee movement, which was always anti-temple, which wasn't connected to the temple. The Pharisee movement, after the destruction of the temple, the Romans were in a position where they had to try to find people amongst the Jews who they could work with and who they could sponsor. This becomes rabbinic Judaism. There were some Jews who said to the Romans, look, if you sponsor us, we will sit down and we will create a type of Judaism that you can live with, that you can deal with. It's basically inward looking. It renounces claims to the Holy Land. It renounces claims to a temple. We don't want a temple. We don't want to rise up and build an army against you. We're happy to be good citizens of the Roman Empire if you just let us get on with our religion and leave us alone. And the Romans were happy with that. They sponsored that type of, they very particularly sponsored that type of Judaism. They gave them grants of land, they gave them money, they gave them scribes, they gave them assistants. And so at the same time as wiping out the more dangerous forms of Judaism, they actively sponsored the benign form of Judaism that became rabbinic Judaism. The rabbis, who are not priests, they're scholars, they have essentially a pacifist point of view. They don't. They in their ideology they delay any claims upon Judea until Elijah cometh, until the end of days, and so forth. And they're happy to be left alone. They will be good citizens of the Roman Empire and not cause any trouble as long as no one causes them any trouble. And the Romans, they come to some sort of accommodation. From the Romans' point of view, he's a peaceful Jew who teaches to love your neighbour and to turn the other cheek, and who stands up to the Jewish authorities. That's the type of Jew that they want to hear about. That's the type of Judaism that the Romans want to hear. So that the Romans certainly had a motivation to create that literature and to create that story and to create that character. There are real textual parallels between the Gospels and Roman literature, and sometimes very explicit ones between, say, Acts of the Apostles and the works of Josephus. I take it as absolutely certain that Acts of the Apostles depends upon, in certain passages, upon the works of Josephus. I think it's clear enough, even though Christian scholars work very hard to deny that fact, because according to their reckoning, all of this literature was written earlier. I'm inclined to the view that it's written somewhat later. The origins of it, the germ of it certainly, is in the Flavian period, because in the Flavian period the Flavians are actively involved in promoting benign forms of Judaism on the one hand, and also Jewish movements or Jewish Gentile movements, which is exactly what Christianity is. It's Judaism for Gentiles. And there was already the beginnings of this in the Roman Empire. It's in fact widespread throughout the Roman Empire, and so the Romans have to do something about it. The question then becomes, well, what type of literature is it exactly? And for this, you need to go have a good knowledge of the type of literature that the Romans were involved in. And Roman literature is not naive by any means. It is very, very sophisticated literature. And it's sophisticated, it plays all sorts of literary tricks. It's highly allusive, and it's a literature of allegory. If we understand that the Gospels aren't reportage, if we understand that the Gospels aren't, you know, someone's first-hand or even second-hand accounts of real literal events, if we understand that literature as instead part of the type of literature that we're finding in Roman literature at that period, then we understand that it's highly sophisticated, allegorical, allusive literature. And so then we start looking for the allegories and for the allusions. To what is this literature alluding? I take it that the background to those allusions are the military campaigns of the Flavian dynasty, the heroes of the new dynasty, of the legitimation mythology of the new dynasty. That is to say, of Vespasian and the 10th Legion and their various campaigns, and of Titus